It's been a roller coaster ride for all of us over the past year, and someone who has had a front row seat to what's going on with our politicians and the decision making behind the pandemic is Dave Boucher. He's a government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press, and we've been so lucky to have you here in Detroit and navigating this crazy world and bringing us the news. How are you doing?
I'm surviving. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. How are you?
We're like you, Dave. Hey, can I ask you, tomorrow is going to be another milestone here in the state of Michigan. I was surprised the governor did not have a big press conference to talk about the easing of the restrictions. What are your thoughts on that?
The governor's going to have a big press conference tomorrow.
There you go.
Restrictions. So yeah, it's going to happen. You're right. It's a big day, as you noted. The Department of Health and Human Services is rolling back the majority of the big remaining restrictions. So the mask mandate, gathering restrictions, capacity restrictions, all related to the COVID-19 pandemic, are all rolling back at 12:01 tomorrow morning. There will be some rules that are still in place, and so that's important to remember. And the pandemic isn't over. We're just barely past 50% of eligible Michiganders who have gotten or who are fully vaccinated, not just with one dose. But tomorrow is a big day for rolling back restrictions.
So what happens if she rolls back the restrictions, but then we see this Delta variant pop up again? It's going to be kind of hard to put some of these restrictions back in place, coming out of where we are now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But I do think that for the past few months, the governor and really the entire health department has shifted its focus from putting out orders out of an abundance of caution to preaching personal responsibility, which is actually a little bit closer to what legislative Republicans and critics of the governor have wanted from the beginning. And now more than ever, vaccines are available. Vaccines are accessible. The broader public has had access to vaccines since early April. And the vaccines have proven to be effective, at least to this point, against all of the variants that are out in the public. So to your point, if we do see a spike, which I don't think would shock anyone since all rules are going away, essentially, and lots of people are coming together, if we start to see an uptick, I would be surprised if the state put in really stringent new rules. Now, that doesn't mean that private businesses or other venues like schools could put in their own rules or their own regulations, but I'd be a little surprised if DHHS put out new statewide orders.
So with that, you just mentioned the GOP. Are these two sides starting to come together? Because we're not hearing the bickering that we did at the beginning and in the middle of this pandemic.
That's a great question. We are not hearing the public feuding. You're totally right. And we have seen some compromise at the legislative level on how the legislature wants to allocate billions of dollars in federal COVID relief. But it's really hard to say because none of these negotiations are happening in public. And this happens in government, especially at the state level and in larger forms of government. You hear public bickering, and when things are supposedly going well, it happens in private until massive deals are unveiled. So, I asked again this morning if there's an update, and I was told no, there's no update on broader budget negotiations between the governor and legislative Republicans. You can look at that as a good thing, or you can look at that as, again, lots of huge decisions being made behind closed doors.
So with that, again, Dave Boucher with us here on the MegaCast. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Does that make your job more difficult or easier?
Transparency always helps. So that makes my job more difficult. And, we talk about this in media. You've talked about this a lot. Transparency and being open helps engender trust and helps people understand not only the media, but their elected officials. And so again, if, for example, when the legislature came out recently, the House and the Senate came out with these big compromises on federal COVID spending. The Senate passed a bill, I think it was $4.3 billion, and how the state was going to use COVID spending. One Democrat stood up and said, I'm glad that we were able to reach an agreement. And that was essentially it. There was no debate. There was no discussion. There was no back and forth on the Senate floor about how billions of dollars that obviously could affect people's lives would be spent. It was just something that was agreed to behind closed doors. Lawmakers and advocates and others will tell you that's the most effective way to do it. But that's just an interesting look at the way our political process works.
And I will say, too, Dave, maybe I'm just a cynic, but I also wonder what are the deals going on behind closed doors, because really we're not seeing a lot from the governor following the big, uproar with her and the plane and going to Florida and the travels. But now it seems that she and the GOP are getting together and there's no public bickering. So I'm just cynical. I'm like, something's going on behind the scenes.
Sure. And again, to what I was talking about before, when these negotiations are happening behind the scenes, it leaves lots of room for doubt and questions. Now, I don't have any evidence or nobody's talked to me about anything untoward happening at all. And to your point about the governor's flights, it's not a campaign year, but it is a campaign year, and there's going to be lots of attention, especially from Republicans, going after Governor Whitmer, who has emerged as a national Democratic person, a profile force. And so all of that's not surprising. But, again, we get the legislation at, the 11th hour. We review it after, essentially, or at the same time as it's being passed by the legislature. And we, as in the Capitol Hill Press Corps, do the best that we can to review what's in there and what the impact will be.
So with that, one thing I think that the two sides really are not going to agree on is when we're talking about the $300 weekly unemployment bonus. The Republicans are saying, hey, time to get rid of this. We need people to go back to work. The governor has a different plan. Do you anticipate she's going to veto it? Where do things stand on that front?
Yeah, I'd be shocked if the governor didn't veto legislation that emerged out of the House last week that would essentially prevent the state from handing out the extra $300 per week unemployment benefit. And it's not necessarily because the governor disagrees with some of these arguments, although I think she probably does. The point that the governor has made is that money that is coming into the states to use for this $300 extra bonus can be used in a relatively complicated way to incentivize people going back to work. So there's something called the state work share program, and if an employer enrolls in the state work share program, they can hire back an employee at less than 100% pay. That employee can be eligible for some unemployment benefits and the $300 per week bonus through the start of September. So if this House bill passes and becomes law, the government not only would not be able to give out that $300 a week bonus to people who are on unemployment and are not working, it wouldn't be able to give out that money through this work share program either, that the governor has heralded and that the Detroit Regional Chamber has heralded and that other people have come out in support of. So that seems to be, a pretty big sign that the governor would not support any legislation that would end the state's usage of this money.
Dave Boucher with us here on the MegaCast. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. And with that, Dave, can I ask, are you going back to Lansing and meeting with people in person, or is your world still, for the most part, virtual?
It just depends on the day. Anybody that's watched Lansing or watched hearings has known that there hasn't really been a mask mandate or social distancing requirements. I think lots of the world saw the hearing with former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani in November at the peak of the pandemic, when lots of people were there without masks, all crowded into a room. So it depends on the day. I'm up in Lansing sometimes, I'm not other days. It just depends on what's going on.
So do you think for the governor's press conference tomorrow, is it going to be in person?
Yes, she's gone back essentially to in-person press conferences for several weeks now. For example, when she announced the new way that she wanted to expand the usage of that unemployment bonus and a $1.4 billion child care plan, she did that in person at a daycare center in Troy, I believe. And so she's had some of these events for a while in person. And I know that there's like a kind of a back and forth between we want to have these events in person because people have been asking for events in person, because when these events happen in person, you tend to get a bigger opportunity for questions and to press a little bit. And then the opposite side of that is, when we have these online events, they're also way more accessible to broader audiences in theory. So I know that office, just like lots of other people, is kind of grappling with how they want to do these moving forward.
Yeah, hybrid may be the way to go, because sometimes, especially when we're talking about trying to get people to Lansing, and you're from other parts of the state, it can be hard to get crews up there or to get them up there in time. as well. And so if you can pop online, you can do it from home. It's a great way to do that. But yeah, I think a hybrid might be kind of the future of journalism as well. Zoom's not going to go away. Do you anticipate that you're going to be doing Zoom interviews probably for years to come?
Sure, absolutely. And people were doing this for a long time before anyway, and this is, especially if you're I covered politics throughout the state. And so, I'd be on the phone with people in Traverse City or Alpena or Marquette or anywhere anyway. And so, while we would love to be out in the field, the demand of the news cycle kind of at times prevents us from going everywhere that we want to go. But yeah, I think that, the Zoom and all some of the other ways that businesses found to work around the pandemic will stick around.
If you would have told us 5 years ago, I remember being broadcast, and you get so envious of some of the print people because they could pick up the phone and call. And while you could do phone interviews for broadcast, they never really worked, and you'd have that picture up and this, that, and the other. But now with people, and you try to do FaceTime and trying to walk people through how to do FaceTime interviews and this, that, and the other. Now everyone is so accustomed to doing Zoom interviews that it really is, I think, just going to be here in journalism, a part of journalism. From here on out, it's going to be changed forever.
Yeah, and it's a broader point about, again, coming back to this idea of transparency and accessibility. Before, if it was just a room full of journalists, the average public might not be able to see the governor's press conference, or might only see 13 seconds of the governor's press conference that aired on the 6 o'clock news, right? But now the accessibility is much greater. Another example of that is the Michigan Supreme Court is meeting today in person for the first time in more than a year, and they're live streaming that hearing. It's about redistricting. It's an important hearing. In theory, there might be some people in the room, and this could be one of those things that lots of people miss. But because it's being broadcast online today, again, a huge topic, many more people are allowed to or able to participate, again, in theory.
With that, too, talking about journalism in general, because as we start to go forward, and we've had so many of these all-city, really, meetings have been virtual, but as they start to go back, what advice would you give to new young journalists if maybe their local municipality isn't offering some of these, like let's say it's an environmental committee meeting. There are so many different meetings that have been virtual. If they don't offer that, what advice would you give to other young journalists starting out?
Well, I think, and this goes back before pandemic time, but I think evaluating, this is a little wonky, but evaluating what meetings you cover and why you cover them is always a good idea. And lots of the news happens outside of meetings. So if you're talking to the right people ahead of the meetings or after the meetings, that can be just as important. Or if you're listening to people who are coming up and giving legitimate concerns or criticisms during the meetings, that can lead to stories as well. But I think a simple conversation with public relations officials in that community about why or why not meetings are live streamed, and if somebody's been live streaming an environmental council subcommittee for the last year and a half and 3 people have watched that meeting, it could be a cost prohibitive function for a county or a community. It's hard to say. But again, as a reporter, I would say a phone call or a simple meeting can usually clear up some of those logistical issues.
Yeah, public hearings or the public comment. When you were a reporter, those were always the best part of the meeting, because you could find out not even necessarily what you were there to cover it, but so many other potential stories down the road as well. Dave Boucher with us here on the MegaCast. He's the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Anything else on the agenda that we should be watching out for?
Yeah, really, this week of the legislature is all about the budget, the state budget. In theory, the legislature is supposed to send the budget bill to the governor before the end of the month. We're not there yet. Conference committees have been appointed, which is supposed to be one of those last steps. But we were talking about it before. It all comes down to Republicans and the governor kind of working together to kind of find this compromise. Lawmakers thought that they were going to hit this deadline. Now it's like up in the air. It might lead to them cutting short some of their summer recess, which I think nobody in the legislature wants to see happen. So we'll see. There could be a big compromise that comes together this week. I think some people are hoping for that, but we're just unsure. And again, this is about how the state uses billions of dollars, which obviously has a real impact on how schools operate, how communities function, all sorts of different things.
One of the best things is follow the money.
Yeah.
But can it be hard to follow the money as a reporter when you're juggling so many stories and on top of trying to, produce stuff for the newspaper, you're also dealing with social media?
It can always be hard to follow the money, but that's why understanding where to look for it is really important. Understanding people to talk to who have followed transparency and funding for many years can be very helpful. But if there's something that somebody doesn't want you to see, especially with how money is being used, it can certainly be difficult to track down.
Dave Boucher with us here on the MegaCast. And with that, we should remind everyone, local journalism matters. Please, please, please subscribe to, the Detroit Free Press, the Detroit News, the Oakland Press. You guys are always running specials right now, and I think you're getting smarter, too, about having some content that is only for subscribers.
Yep, we always have big deals, and we encourage everybody to sign up whenever they can. They tend to be pretty affordable, like $1 a month for 6 months, and then some of that content, as you mentioned, is geared towards subscribers. And most of our Detroit Lions coverage is for subscribers. More of our political coverage is becoming for subscribers. So we obviously encourage and appreciate all subscriptions that we have.
Dave Boucher, we always appreciate your time as well.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Anything, before we say goodbye, that you want to mention that maybe I didn't ask you?
No, you hit a lot of good spots. Again, we're trying to, the money, as we mentioned, is the big issue this week, and we'll be tracking that as closely as we can.
And remember, when our politicians say it's free money, it's not free money. That's my pet peeve, Dave.
Yeah, that's fair. Somebody's paying for it somewhere.
Exactly, and that's us, the taxpayers.